And Vance was saying, Vance says he supports IVF, he supports IUI, he says he has friends who've gone through both, and he's like, anyone who's gone through that process of trying to conceive a child would know the difference pretty plainly between the two procedures. And furthermore, he kind of equated it to, the criticism over Walz military service and military record. He actually used the phrase pathological to describe some of his tendency to, I suppose, like flub the truth or exaggerate. And so I think that's going to be a continued line of attack for Republicans against Walz.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by economics reporter Zach Halaschak. Zach, before we talk about anything else, one of the big topics this week has been the sort of revision of the jobs numbers, and this has caused a lot of confusion and conversation. Explain what's happened.
So every so often, the government basically looks back at the data from, every month they have the jobs report, look back at the data and kind of see if everything shook out the way it was originally reported, and they kind of reassess. So this is the preliminary estimate for what, the past several jobs reports have been like over the past year. And it found that there was some 800,000 or so jobs less than was originally reported. And yeah, that's a larger than average downward revision, but it's completely normal to have these reassessments where things go up and down. And again, these aren't the final numbers. Sure. That'll be, I think, January of 2025 when those are finally released. So we have several more months to go of jobs data. But yeah, it's not good news for President Joe Biden, for Vice President Kamala Harris, who's now the Democratic nominee. Anytime you see job growth moving in the wrong direction, it's never a good sign. And obviously you already see former President Trump lashing out about it and calling the numbers phony and that saying that the Biden administration fudged them on purpose. Obviously that's not the case because, the agency itself released it and said there was 800,000 less. But it's anything when you have jobs going down, it's going to be used as a line of an attack. But we'll have to see how it shakes out as it gets revised down the line.
Right, because the health of the labor market has been one of the economic bright points for the Biden-Harris administration to tout.
And even with the revision, it's still, by historic standards, pretty strong job growth over the past year. So.
So you've spent some time with Senator J.D. Vance. He's former President Donald Trump's running mate, the Republican nominee for vice president. He's had some interesting comments that he made about Republicans, Trump, and the labor unions.
Yeah, so I followed him on the campaign trail this week. We were out went from Ohio to Wisconsin, and he was at a campaign event in Wisconsin in Kenosha, and I had a chance to ask him about UAW, the United Auto Workers leader, Shawn Fain, the night before, had spoke at the DNC and actually called Trump and Vance lapdogs for the billionaire class, and just really had a full-throated attack against Vance and Trump. Vance is a little different than a lot of mainstream Republicans because he sort of embraces the blue-collar working class. There's a lot of union members in Ohio, and if you remember back last year...
he's a populist.
He is. He's an economic populist. And so that kind of, there's a natural embrace of unions and populism to some extent. He obviously isn't a huge union guy per se, but he's, for instance, last year when UAW was striking, he went out to the picket line and was visiting with the strikers, which is not something you do really see Republicans doing. So I asked him, I was like, what are your thoughts on Fain attacking you, and then sort of how do you plan to galvanize support among union members for the ticket? He was dismissive about Fain, said Fain was just upset because a lot of Fain's membership is going to end up voting for Trump. But in terms of...
So Fain was feigning outrage,
He was feigning outrage, yes. That's what he said. And but he said the difference between he and the Harris ticket, or the Trump ticket and the Harris ticket, is that Trump is really prioritizing U.S. jobs and like making sure that the economy and manufacturing sector are built up through the use of like tariffs. That's a populist policy is, we want to reshore jobs here in the U.S. by putting up these new tariff regimes. So that was kind of his selling point, was like, maybe in the past Republicans might not have been the party you'd think, but we have open arms and we want to embrace these union members. So that will be a point, I think, going to the election to see how much the unions support this ticket compared to other election cycles past.
So one other area where Vance distinguishes himself from a lot of other Republicans is in his admiration for one particular Biden administration official.
Yeah, so he kind of generated some big headlines earlier this year when he said that FTC, Federal Trade Commission, lead Lena Khan was doing a pretty good job. And that's unusual because she's a Biden appointee, and you have the vice presidential contender for the Republicans saying that someone Biden appointed is doing an all right job. So I asked him, I just was wondering, do you still think she's doing a good job, and sort of would you push to keep her on if Trump is reelected? And he didn't really get into the whether he would push for her to stay on, but he said he gave her some qualified praise. He said she's really good on going after these big tech companies, which Vance is not popular. He's not a fan of these big tech companies.
Right.
So he agreed with her on that. And he also, and then he's disagreed some. He said he thinks she's going a little too strongly against smaller companies. But then he also said he did like that she wasn't kind of going to the so-called like woke and DEI type bent that some of these Biden agencies are kind of falling into, and that he appreciated that she's kind of sticking to the remit of the FTC and kind of focusing solely on its mission rather than like going down these rabbit holes that you've seen a lot of Republicans criticize the agencies for under the Biden administration. So we'll see if he tries to keep her on or. But it is interesting whenever you have that kind of dichotomy between Republicans and Democrats, and you have a Republican at the top of the ticket praising the opponent's appointee.
Now, one Democrat who Vance doesn't seem to get along very well with would be his Democratic rival for the vice presidency, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Vance has taken the lead on the latest Walz-related controversy.
Yeah, so Vance has kind of repeatedly hammered the idea that Walz is a liar, or is, at least very kind of flubs what he's saying and toes the line between truth and untruth. And so one instance of this that happened this week was, Walz got out in the campaign trail and has been talking about how IVF is crucial. It's an important issue to him personally because his kids were conceived through IVF.
That includes IVF. And this gets personal for me and my family. When my wife and I decided to have children, we spent years going through infertility treatments. And I remember praying every night for a call for good news. The pit in my stomach when the phone rang, and the agony when we heard that the treatments hadn't worked. So it wasn't by chance that when we welcomed our daughter into the world, we named her Hope.
Well, it turns out that it was actually not IVF.
Right.
No, it was intrauterine insemination, or IUI, which is an entirely different procedure. I mean, the goal is the same. It's to create a pregnancy.
But it doesn't raise the same ethical concerns that pro-lifers have raised about the other
No, because
process.
IUI doesn't involve an embryo being in a lab outside the body, that sort of thing. While IVF does, and that's kind of caused some social conservatives anxiety over that. So it's two very different things. And Vance was saying, Vance says he supports IVF, he supports IUI, he says he has friends who've gone through both, and he's like, anyone who's gone through that process of trying to conceive a child would know the difference pretty plainly between the two procedures. And furthermore, he kind of equated it to, the criticism over Walz's military service and military record. He actually used the phrase pathological to describe some of his tendency to, I suppose, like flub the truth or exaggerate. And so I think that's going to be a continued line of attack for Republicans against Walz, is sort of that he's a liar. That's what they're going to accuse him of. And I don't know. We'll see if that's a winning attack in the election. But I think that's something to keep an eye on heading into November.
Definitely looking forward to that vice presidential debate. Thank you, Zach.
Yes, sir.
You can read Zach and the rest of our policy team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.